All right, welcome everybody to the 2025 VVBGA Winter Webinar Series. Today we're talking about planning cover crop sequences for pollinators and growers. My name is Laura Johnson. I work with UVM Extension. I'm the pollinator support specialist. And I'll kick us off with a little bit of an introduction, and then we're going to hear from three farms. Those folks are Colin O'Brien from Common Roots Farm, Jake Kornfeld from the farm at VYCC, and Spencer Hardy at the Farm Upstream. And I just want to take a second to thank our sponsors, the Vermont Vegetable and Berry Growers Association, the Northeast Extension Risk Management Education Program, the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, and the Transition to Organic Partnership Program. So thanks to all those folks for making this happen or possible. And then, of course, thanks to the farms that are able to join us today to share their experiences. So, I'll just start off with some quick protocols. Also, if anybody feels inspired to use this QR code to link to a survey that we've been sending out on the listserv, and the newsletter. We've been doing this 2025 Pollinator Support Practices Survey. If you haven't done it already, that QR code refers to that. But the webinar will be recorded today and then posted on the VVBGA website. If you feel inspired to introduce yourself in the chat with your name, pronouns, farm, and perhaps responding to this prompt, what opportunities are there to integrate flowering cover crops for season-long blooms into existing spaces or times of year on your farm? I'll try to post that in the chat. Feel free to do that as well. And then finally, there's going to be two QR codes. This one that we're just seeing now, which will go away in just a second, for the survey that we're trying to finish up this month. And then at the end of the webinar, for any crop advisors that might be joining us, there is one crop management credit for those folks here. So just to ground ourselves, so when we're talking about pollinators in farm landscapes, these are the general groups that we're talking about. Of course, there are more out there, but thinking about insects, it's, bees, beetles, wasps, flies, moths, and butterflies. And then in terms of crop pollination, some of these insect groups and types are going to be more efficient and better pollinators than others. So if you're thinking about specifically crop pollination, butterflies may not be your target pollinator, but if you're just thinking about biodiversity on a whole in the farm landscape, then all of these insect types, of course, are very important. I tend to focus a lot on wild bee pollination in my work with extension, and we generally know a lot more about bees when it comes to crop pollination than other insect types, though not all crops are entirely pollinated or pollinated at all by bees. But most of the crops, if not all, in Vermont are at least in part pollinated by bees, wild bees and domestic bees. So wild bees tend to be a bit more resilient in our variable weather conditions that we have here. And they're also just in our landscape and providing a kind of free ecosystem service to us on farms. Honeybees are domesticated, and so they don't survive very well in the Northeast on their own and need to be brought in and cared for. Wild bees are also found in the research to provide higher yield and quality of crops, but they can be quite challenging to assess in our landscapes. Unlike with managed bees like honeybees, or even if you're buying in bumblebees, you can kind of calculate stocking rates in relation to the crop and the how much space the crop is taking up. So pollinators are facing threats, many of which I'm sure you're familiar with in terms of loss of habitat and resource diversity, pests and pathogens, pesticides and climate change, and work done from the Vermont Center for Eco Studies and Vermont Fish and Wildlife, which Spencer, one of our speakers today, was also a big part of, has shown that at least 55 of Vermont's native wild bee species are in need of significant conservation action. So there's a lot of ways that farms can go about approaching these challenges. And today we're just going to talk about one tool in the toolbox for thinking about how to support wild bees in our farm landscapes. And so that tool we're talking about today are cover crops. And whenever working with folks on cover cropping strategies on farms, soil health is always kind of top of the list in terms of mitigating the effects that intensive vegetable crop rotations can have on our landscape. So, but in addition to that, often folks are cover cropping for beneficial insects, and within that umbrella term, fall pollinators. So by providing flowers, more specifically in terms of cover cropping, we can help support the forage resources of pollinators in our landscape. So I just want to highlight kind of the importance of a soil health practice like cover cropping and how it also supports insects in the landscapes, in that by helping to cultivate healthy soils, we have healthy plants, which of course is good for our businesses, but also when it comes to providing resources for these bees and other insects that are pollinating our cucurbits or fruit crops, the nectar and pollen resources are going to be much higher in value if the plants are grown in healthy soils. Also, many of our wild bees, about 70% of all wild bees live in the soil. This is an image from Xerces' publication called Farming with Soil Life, and it's just showing there are 5 representations of different types of tunnel nesting bees or soil nesting bees, and what the structures of their nests look like in the soil profile. So having healthy can help encourage this nesting habit to occur on the landscape. Soil texture is also a big part of where bees are located and where their nests can be built. Also, texture is, of course, influencing plant communities in our landscape. And some research that was done quite a while ago now is shown on or represented by this soil texture triangle. And so what we have here is this triangle kind of helps folks to classify percent of sand, silt, and clay in a soil. And all of these little shapes are indicators of different types of bee nests and where they're found in these different percentages and combinations of soil texture types. So you can see that soils that tend to be higher in percent sand and silt tend to be a little bit more favorable for bee nesting. So just being cognizant of that, and you don't obviously have a lot of influence over your soil texture, but other soil health qualities you can directly manage on your farm. So today we're going to be hearing from 3 farms that were part of a group that Becky Madden and I facilitated last year in 2024 of 10 farms that tried out some cover crop sequences of annual cover crops in their farm systems. And as part of that, soil health samples were taken, cover crops were planted on the land at, you know, half an acre to an acre of space throughout the season. Pollinators were monitored by the growers, and then growers came together to share outcomes of those trials. And this is our calendar plan that we started out with last year in thinking about annual cover crops that provide floral resources that could be planted in sequence. So we had field peas, buckwheat, phacelia, and field mustard as four annual cover crops, starting seeding in April and then finishing seeding up in July. The green boxes represent the seeding time estimates, and then the yellow boxes were estimated times of bloom for each of those types of cover crops. So this was our plan, and we'll hear from our growers today about how they did or did not follow that plan and why and how things were adjusted in their systems specifically. So just to highlight the insects that were the groups that were monitored by growers were those main insect groups that I had in my first slide. And then we have some, we kind of crowdsourced from the group their experiences on benefits and trade-offs and comparison to what might be found in the literature, and some of which coincided and some of which differed based on experience. So if anybody is interested in seeing this more in depth, we have a handout summarizing all of that. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we're going to hear from Colin from Common Roots Farm.
Great. Hey guys, I'm Colin. I've been working at Common Roots Farm for 4 years now. Um, and we're really excited to be part of this peer group for many reasons, and we'll run you through how we went about this and our findings. Um, there it is. All right. So quick overview of Common Roots. We're a nonprofit. We run about 13 acres of diversified vegetable production. Our main outlets, we have a small farm stand on site at the farm. We donate a lot to the food shelf, so it's probably about a third of our produce ends up in the food shelves, and internal sales as well, meaning we do like catering, we sell prepared meals, we have value-added products, farm to fork, farm to school, um, and a couple other things. So at Common Roots, we are sitting right on the Virgins clay deposit and have really heavy soils. So cover cropping has been one of the most effective ways to kind of reduce compaction and keep all of our nutrients in the soil. So reduce erosion, improve soil health, improve water quality, suppress weeds, minimize soil compaction, promote microbiology, and break up pest cycles is another big one. And that's kind of why we opted to not do the mustards, just because flea beetles are kind of one of the things we struggle with most in terms of pests at Common Roots. We'll talk about that in a bit. So the plot that we decided to use for the study had never been farmed before. It used to be a 200-foot windrow that I don't know when it was created, but it was recently excavated, and SD Ireland decided to give us this half-acre plot. And we felt it'd be perfect for this study because we didn't plan on using it at all this year or this past season. So we just wanted to have it cover cropped all year. We didn't quite end up doing that just because of the flooding, and it's a higher up field. So we were able to get our second succession of brassicas in there. And one of our other fields was just too wet. So we didn't get to cover crop the whole year. Um, but you can see this is the soil test, and I was blown away. It's actually some of the best soil on the farm. Um, and it has like a lot of kind of higher and lower points. Um, in the field. Um, but that's why this study was so awesome for us. It really was a great, the cover crop ended up being a great indicator of, seeing these higher or lower spots, spots with more water, more compaction. Um, so this is the cover crop sequence that we ended up going with. We did 2 rounds of oats and peas and 2 rounds of buckwheat mixed with Phacelia. Um, the buckwheat had by far the most amount of pollinators consistently throughout this study. Um, so we broadcasted everything by hand, and then to terminate, um, we flail mowed it and then just incorporated it with the chisel plow. Um, so it was really nice to have kind of multiple fields that we ended up using, because we had these 2 first rounds of oats and peas simultaneously. So when we terminated one, all the pollinators kind of had another place to go. Yeah, buckwheat and Phacelia was very successful for pollinators. Our Phacelia didn't get very great germination. So I think in the future we'd probably just do thicker buckwheat. Um, we have some pictures in a sec that you can see. Um, and yeah, like I said, we opted out of doing the mustard greens just because, yeah, flea beetles with brassicas is a problem. So yeah, this fit really well into our, oops, sorry, into our cash crop rotations. Like I mentioned earlier, it was seeded into a brand new field that we'd never farmed before. Um, and it responded to soil conditions to help us inform us on bed arrangement based on the cover crop greenness. There was a crazy um, color gradient. We didn't get great pictures of it. I wish we had, but you can see a little bit in a sec. But it informed us on where we would want to dig a drainage ditch and kind of how to orient the beds in this field, which was really valuable. Um, in the April oats and peas seeding lined up really well with our second succession of brassicas and cucurbits. It's like just kept the field nice and covered and fixing nitrogen, and then right when we were ready to transplant, we were able to terminate. So this is a picture of that brand new field. And it's kind of hard to see here, but right in that uh, kind of in the middle, you can see it where it might get a little lower, like less growth. Um, but that's kind of where we ended up trying to channel the water. It was just so much more compacted there. Um, it was a really intense difference between kind of the center of the field. This is the same field from another angle. Most of the field was really beautiful. And then this was a different field where you can actually kind of see the gradient pretty well. This field we had farmed before. But you see on the right-hand side of this picture, uh, where you just stop seeing the blooms, that was all seeded as well. Um, and it did not, yeah, it was far more compact. And it's just a lower area. We get a lot of more standing water with the heavy clay. You can see all the nice houses surrounded by. So in terms of next steps for us, this is like a quick overview of our crop rotation. We have 3 separate crop rotations, and then we put in where we'd be cover cropping. Um, so this is for our heavier soil that we can't really direct seed in or anything, but we do heavy feeders followed by cover crops. This is our lighter soil rotation. Yeah, early greens with summer cover crop. And then this is our house rotation. So try and do as many houses as we can with the clay. And that is all I have for you guys.
Great. Thank you. And if folks have any questions as we go through these, feel free to put them in the chat or hold on to them and we can discuss at the end. I don't see anything in the chat right now, Colin, so we'll move to our next speaker, Jake.
Yeah. Hey folks, my name is Jake Kornfeld. I am coming in today as the manager of the farm at the Vermont Youth Conservation Corps in Richmond. Yeah, it was a great time to do this project. The Vermont Youth Conservation Corps farm hosts a lot of young people, and they were thrilled about this. I mean, giving them a clipboard and telling them to go look at flowers and count bugs in the middle of their workday is quite a treat. So we're in Richmond, just above the Winooski River, Bunsen, Raynham, Silt Loam. So it's fascinating. I hadn't seen that soil texture triangle, but I'm curious how that plays out on pretty silty soils on our farm. We're a certified organic farm. We grow about 10 acres of annual crops. We've had as many as 14 acres in production, but every year we've been shrinking down, trying to cut out areas that heavy rains have just kind of been carrying soils away. So trying to learn how to grow more intensively on a smaller footprint and still fit in our cover crops. Our outlet is primarily a 450 member CSA called the Healthcare Share. We serve folks who are struggling with food insecurity or diet-related illness through their medical center. And so it's free to the participants, and they're sort of prescribed share of vegetables for anywhere from 8 to 20. This is going to be 27 weeks is our longest share this year. And it's all over central and northern Vermont. We also mostly are a youth development, workforce development nonprofit. So we hire about 60 young people every season to help us run the farm in various iterations. They're all paid. A lot of them are AmeriCorps members. It's the first job for a lot of people. It's usually the first time on a farm in a meaningful way for a lot of people. So we try to sort of keep the work engaging so that they want to be invested in agriculture and working lands and not just weeding carrots all day, every day. So this was a great opportunity for us to mix in some hands-on sort of experiential education. Definitely learned that not everybody has the attention to detail to tell which pollinator is which. So there was a pretty steep learning curve on what data we were collecting and who we were trusting. But I think we got some usable data, but most of, I think, what I have to share is sort of qualitative observations. So we started with the same plan as everybody else. We use a lot of cover crops in general. I try to get cover crop down within 2 weeks of the last harvest of any crop. We've seen with our soils that anything uncovered will sort of either cap and nothing will germinate, or it will just start to gully and wash away. So as quick as we can get living roots in the ground, there's huge advantages for us on soil health and just general sustainability of our farm. So we've done a lot of cover cropping, but honestly have never really paid attention to who's visiting which cover crops. And haven't really thought about flowering windows and issues and opportunities associated with that, other than like, when do we terminate a crop? We have had some good success using buckwheat as a nurse crop for clovers and sorghum Sudan grass. And so we tried to do that in this project as well, but ended up getting burned on that a little bit by just an equipment issue. We broke the PTO shaft on our mower, and it took 6 weeks to get a new one fixed on there. So the buckwheat kind of took over and outcompeted some of our other things, but that just means we got a lot of great experience with buckwheat. All the blocks that we grew in were slated for a full season of cover cropping. So I think all of these things have a place in a, part of a season rotation, but because we were checking out flowers and wanted to give things as long as possible, I sort of slotted them all into fields where we didn't have a time pressure of getting another planting in. I thought it would be helpful to just sort of run through each crop that we did and what was successful about it, what we saw. So oats and peas, we have already done a lot of, but had never really let it go this long before. So that spring seeding we put down at 120 pounds per acre of peas, 40 pounds an acre of oats. Just a great cover crop combo for so many reasons. It's easy. It's a great weed suppressor. You get free nitrogen and it kills in the frost in the fall. But we let it go to flower and just sort of decided to let it reseed because we didn't have anything in particular slated afterwards. So letting it reseed, we waited until sort of seemed like most of the blooms were done, and then just did 2 light passes with discs. First pass just kind of like pushed it all down and killed it off, and then the second pass flipped a little bit of soil around, and it was a fantastic second succession. We had very little weed pressure, and it meant a bit less disturbance and saving on seed cost. In terms of pollinators, it was certainly not the most popular. We would sort of get out there and see a handful of, I mean, there was a mix. I don't think we saw any butterflies or moths on the oats and peas, but I think someone else had noted that tarnished plant bug is definitely present in there, which is a consideration for sure. But both the spring and the fall flowering windows, we didn't see a lot of pollinator activity. All-site clover. This was not on the list, but we ended up with a really beautiful planting of it. So I figured why not count and see what was going on. So this was broadcast at 20 pounds an acre, following our broiler flock going through, just kind of creating a nice poopy mat for everything. So that was late May, early June, and just broadcast it on the soil and let it do its thing. It came in really nice and thick. A bit of pigweed made it through late in the season, which we were able to just sort of mow over the top and take that out. And it was cool because it had, I think, of the crops, we grew the longest flowering window. So it was probably like mid-August through late September, we had active blooms. And it definitely had a lot of activity, a ton of bees in there. But again, get a bit of tarnished plant bug. We used to grow strawberries, so this would have been a bigger consideration. We haven't in the last couple of years, so I'm not too worried about it. Buckwheat was, as Colin said, clear pollinator winner. It's like you get close to a field of buckwheat and it just is buzzing. You can hear it, you can feel it. It's just dozens of insects everywhere you look. So we put down 50 pounds an acre, cultipacked it. We use buckwheat in a ton of different places on our farm. Just anytime we have a gap, we'll put buckwheat down, and anytime we want to sort of like push to get a different cover crop in, we'll use buckwheat. We use it as a nurse crop for some of the slower germinating covers, but learned this season, thank you, Becky, that seed becomes viable really early. So I haven't worried about buckwheat a ton as a weed because it's easy to kill, but it is everywhere on our farm now. And so we'll see how much of an issue that is next season. And then the Phacelia was a dud, honestly. It was an exciting premise and it looks like a cool plant. And I feel like reading about it, there's a lot of excitement around it and its potential as a cover crop to support pollinators, but it was really slow to germ. It was not competitive with anything. It definitely got outcompeted by the buckwheat. This was the one we tried to use the buckwheat as a nurse crop for, and it yeah, I mean, even after we managed to sort of get the buckwheat under control, it was like that one in the middle with the fronds is the Phacelia. And so 10 pounds an acre felt like a reasonable rate, and it just, we got almost nothing coming through. We did have a planter where we just like seeded it super thick to just have a little demo plot of it. And so we got it to flower in there, but even in that little planter, it was like no particular appeal to pollinators. I think if we had had the same planter full of buckwheat, we probably would have seen more. Few final thoughts. I think if pollination is a key concern when you're cover cropping, it's really worthwhile to learn when the seed becomes viable. I was pleasantly surprised by the oats and peas reseeding, but I think whether the clover reseeded, that might become an issue in future seasons. We had our buckwheat next to our potato planting and had the lowest Colorado potato beetle pressure that we've ever had. And so I'm just wondering if buckwheat is also hosting a lot of beneficial predatory insects. And then my last thought was just going to try next year a multi-species mix to try to get a longer flowering window through the whole season without a lot of soil disturbance. So, if we think about going out into a healthy meadow, there's flowers from late April maybe through like October, and we were talking about like 4 to 6 week flowering windows here. And so if we really want to support pollinators, can we come up with some magic combo where we can, through management by mowing, just have flowers for more of the season? Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to be a part of a cool project.
Perfect. Thank you. Let me see. Our last presenter is Spencer Hardy from the Farm Upstream.
Great, thanks. Yeah, and as Laura mentioned a little bit, my background is in pollinator conservation and entomology, but I'm also a co-owner of the Farm Upstream with Jake and a couple others here in Jericho. It's a new property for us. We've been on leased land for a few years. Bought this old dairy farm in fall of 2023. There was a gravelly, sandy hayfield that had been pretty well abused. There was not a lot of nutrients left, not a lot of pollinator activity, not a lot of hedgerows or edge habitat, and not a lot of nutrients in the soil. This past fall was our first season. We opened a little farm stand, and this coming season we're going to have a CSA farm stand, a little bit of wholesale, and a native plant nursery that is sort of tangential to this work. But last summer I noticed a few things in melon and zucchini here that to me look like insufficient pollination. There might be other explanations, but at least the melon, the half of it there doesn't have viable seeds and obviously not a viable fruit or a commercially viable fruit. So I think even in this landscape where there's some, it's not a giant monoculture in the Midwest, but there does appear to be some pollination limitation on the crops that we were growing last summer. And then the pests I'll talk about in a little bit, but we more or less tried to follow the calendar that Laura provided at the beginning. We did do the mustard and did a couple late summer plantings of peas and oats. The peas and oats worked pretty well. Like others, not a ton of pollinator activity. There were some bumblebees on there, which are important for pollination for a lot of the crops that we're growing. Also tarnished plant bug. The picture on the left here is the Phacelia a week or two after I mowed the buckwheat. So we used buckwheat as a nurse crop, and we got a pretty good Phacelia stand underneath the buckwheat. It was a new field without a lot of weed pressure. Some weeds came through, but the Phacelia I felt like was establishing pretty well. And then as soon as I mowed the buckwheat, it all burned and shriveled up. And at that point, the weeds came out and we terminated it. But there's maybe potential there. I think it's worth playing around with a little more. The mustard, we had a really patchy, it was a small planting, but probably some nutrient deficiencies in part of the planting. In terms of pollinators, lots of honeybees on the mustard and a lot of hoverflies and potential beneficial insects. Not a lot of wild native pollinators, bees at least. Certainly flies and honeybees really enjoyed the mustard. Bumblebee that was hanging out, I'm pretty sure it was the same individual, was in the market garden for a couple of weeks this fall going back and forth between the late season peas and oats and then some of our green beans that were still flowering. Kind of cool to see. And the rest of this is a bunch of wasps and other insects that either Laura and I photographed. They all happen to be on buckwheat. And yes, there were a ton of bees and other insects on buckwheat. Not a lot of native wild bee diversity. It's a lot of honeybees, but then a lot of wasps and flies that I think are potentially beneficials. I don't know enough about the species identification to tell exactly what these things are eating, but this genus of wasp is a Lepidoptera parasite. This is a cool one that I was able to identify as a species. It's a parasitic fly. One of its hosts is a biocontrol, so it's a predator of a beneficial, but it's also a predator of southern green stink bug, which may become a pest here at some point. And I think there's a lot of cases where there's sort of ambiguous whether or not what these insects are doing and how they're playing into the landscape, but it's cool to see and certainly doesn't hurt. This one is a parasite of a European corn borer. This one is only identified to the family level, but it's probably eating a lot of aphids as a larva. And then visiting the buckwheat as an adult. And then this last slide is some work that Laura and I have been doing, looking at cover crop insects and which ones are potentially most valuable for commercial operations. Bumblebees, I think, are really, I mean, many of you are probably familiar with bumblebees in tomatoes and blueberries and apples, and they're workhorse generalist pollinators, and certainly appreciated the peas, maybe a few on the buckwheat. I know some species really like clover. Honeybees, Laura mentioned, all over the buckwheat. But then there's all these other bees that are potentially have different floral preferences that may or may not be supported by buckwheat, as well as a lot of these flies we don't know a lot about. And lady beetles are another well-known beneficial, primarily as a aphid control, but also potentially a pollinator. There's a few species that eat a fair amount of pollen as adults and are visiting flowers. I think that's all I have.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and I'll just note, as I did in the beginning, looking at that last slide that Spencer just showed, some of these pollinator group types are more beneficial for some of cash crops versus others. And when I think about beetles, like lady beetles in terms of crop pollination, crops like strawberries, if you grow strawberries, which are readily accessible in terms of their flower, and also in part pollinated by wind, see a lot of beetles and flies on those types of flowers, which function as pollinators, versus something like a blueberry, which may need insects or pollinators that can kind of get in the flower a little bit better than a beetle or fly might. So just thinking about that and what you're growing. And I do see one question in the chat right now from Vern, and it is asking, do you think it's worth continuing to trial Phacelia? So anyone who wants to pipe in on that, feel free.
I'll jump in here, and seems like universally there were challenges with it in the field. This fall, sort of just for fun, I did a part of one of our tunnels in peas, oats, and Phacelia, probably seeded in like mid-September. And I was just out there the other day, and the Phacelia seems to have overwintered all right. The peas and oats are dead, but the Phacelia is starting to put on some new growth. So maybe there's a use for it there to do a early spring bloom in a tunnel before you put in a summer cash crop. We'll see what happens there, but it's a cool plant. I'm excited to play with it a little more.
I want to keep trying it as part of a mix, but I don't think it does well on its own or like as a significant portion. Maybe in other parts of the country it would. I'm also curious, and I would need Spencer or Laura's help for this, but does it attract native insects that a lot of our other cover crops seem not to attract as nicely? And then on the buckwheat question, maybe it's done well in some of our siltiest, wettest fields, but it also has totally bit the dust sometimes in really heavy rains.
And I'll just say the question out loud for folks who might listen later on. Would buckwheat do well in a wettish area? So, and if anybody else has experience with that, please chime in. I know I've mostly seen it kind of as used as a summer smother, and it does pretty well in kind of drier conditions. But I saw Vern, you popped on your video. I don't know if you have something you want to say.
Thanks for the great presentations. And so my question is about buckwheat establishment and getting a good stand. As you know, this coming year, we'll be doing some more on-farm trials with sequential plantings of buckwheat. I saw you did 50 pounds to the acre, Jake. That seems lower than the recommendations you read out there. Colin, you had some areas where it did well, it didn't. Just your thoughts on what would be good recommendations to folks to get the best possible stands of buckwheat equipment, fertility, seeding rates, anything that you observed.
I did a light till to incorporate it, and had a lot of success. In the past, I've tried disking it in, and it was okay in some areas, but we definitely had more success with lightly tilling it in to incorporate. And then, yeah, like you guys were saying, it did really well in those kind of higher up areas, but where we had more standing water, it was not nearly as successful.
What seeding rate did you use?
I think we did around 75 pounds to the acre. I'd have to double check. And then I think we've mixed it with 10 pounds of Phacelia per acre.
Yeah, we seeded at 50 pounds an acre because we wanted it to just be a nurse crop. And so we did see some weed pressure later in the cycle from that. When we've done buckwheat on its own, I've done 100 pounds an acre, and felt pretty happy with that. That does a nice, full blanket. Haven't fertilized it in terms of seeding. We just broadcast it with a spin seeder, and then have had luck both with a just shallow pass, like 1 or 2 inch deep pass with discs, and also cultipacking as long as we had disked previously. So like in this case, we disked to kill off the rye that was there before. We might disk to kill off a planting, and then we'll just cultipack afterwards instead of trying to disc it back in. That's worked well.
And I'll just mention one of the farms that was part of our group trying this out last year had buckwheat established prior to flooding. And then the floods came through pretty dramatically in their landscape, and it was pretty impressive to see how well the buckwheat held up in those conditions after already being established, and continued to flower. So I just wanted to note that as well. And I see in the chat the question about my use of the terminology summer smother. Yes, Charlene, that means smothering weeds. And for your context, I'm thinking about in pasture. If you're not looking to transition that to cash crops quite yet, you might consider a really close mow or tight mow in the fall to kind of really expose some of that bare ground, and frost seed some clovers in the early spring, kind of around sugaring time. So now, or even maybe a little sooner. And that will help to kind of bring in more blooms into the landscape if that's something that you're hoping to try out. I think before we close, and feel free to keep asking away. Before we close, I just wanted to share a resource with folks that I've found helpful in my work, and I'll just share my screen quickly to show that. And thinking about next steps, if you're interested in trying to kind of think through sequences of flowering cover crops for kind of benefiting soil health and then also benefiting insects, both pollinators and other beneficials, there are 2 really excellent resources that are very accessible also in terms of digesting the content. And one is this SARE cover cropping for pollinators and beneficial insects. And that has a lot of information around attractiveness of cover crop blooms to different types of species types, and then also considers challenges with pests that might also be in those cover crops, which we heard from some of our farms today in terms of tarnished plant bug, maybe, and mustard harboring flea beetle. And then the second resource that is more recently was put out was this pollinator friendly cover cropping for vegetable producers in this work was done in the upper Midwest, but similar type of climate, and again just has some really awesome details about the specific insects that may be coming to visit flowering cover crops, and also kind of the soil health benefits associated with the cover crops that are also beneficial to pollinators. So these are two resources that I would recommend if you're interested in going more in depth and detail and thinking about planning. And I wanted to highlight this calendar example that's in that cover cropping for pollinators in the Midwest, and it kind of describing these opportunities and times in space and the season when you may be able to incorporate flowering or blooming cover crops. So I wanted to just highlight that. And then I've got a few pictures here to share of some examples of these, full season cover crop on fallow fields, spring cover crop, late summer fall cover crop, intercropping, and kind of year-round perennial cover crops. So an example of a full season cover crop on fallowed cover crop fallowed land, a mix of winter rye with a bunch of different types of legume species, vetch, red and white clover, and you don't see it here, but there were spots with crimson clover as well. So this is going to be left on for a full season with mowing as management for weeds that might need to be clipped, or just exposing. Oh, there's a little bit of crimson clover in the middle. So one example of that full season cover. This is an example of crimson clover that was planted in the late summer, early fall, near an apiary that provided some really wonderful spring blooms, established really well. This is pretty sandy soil here and overwintered quite well, as you can see. So an example of kind of partial season spring cover of crimson clover, and that's in Plainfield, New Hampshire. And again, another picture, we've seen some examples of buckwheat so far. This is in South Royalton, an August bloom of buckwheat for partial season summer cover. And an example of intercropping between squashes with the mustard here at Bare Roots Farm in Williamstown. So an example, one type of intercropping between veg beds, but I've also been speaking with a lot of growers lately who are incorporating plugs into their transplanting and intercropping in row with their cash crop of flowering plants. And then finally, perennial cover in a non-crop area, so like drive rows or field margins. And this is at Edgewater Farm in Plainfield, New Hampshire, with white Dutch clover between some tomato beds here. So really prolific spring blooms that and this sort of kind of situation can be maintained with mowing during the season to clip weeds back. So I'll stop there with that, and then I'll put up the QR code for any crop advisors that may be with us today. But thank you everybody for coming and for asking your questions and being a part of our webinar series. And if anybody needs us for any longer period of time, just reach out to me. And next week we have what's new in Colorado potato beetle control with Granson Farm in Maine and Crossroad Farm in Norwich. And Vic Izzo from UVM will be facilitating that discussion, same time, noon to 1 next week to continue our series. So thank you very much, and look forward to our next webinar. And again, this will all be on the YouTube channel and on Spotify if people prefer to just listen. So thank you very much.